Hello, my name is Tom Innes. I'm not Teo, but I'm actually joined by Teo, who is here today to talk about an article he wrote for Voice a couple of weeks ago. So, hi, Teo.
Hi, hello, it is me.
Hey. So, how are you doing today?
I'm alright. Had a few problems with tech, but we're here. We're present.
Yep,
We're recording.
present. Yeah, just about. Yeah, I would have thought after all of these months of being in lockdown, we'd have sort of solved all of the technical problems, but new ones seem to just pop up instead.
Yeah.
So, we're here to talk about an article you wrote. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what that was?
Yeah. So basically, I wrote an article on asking whether attitudes to immigration would change in the wake of COVID-19, because obviously a lot of people who are immigrants or are descendants of immigrants have been involved in the responses to COVID-19, whether that be in the medical field or as carers or as cleaners or as bus drivers or in a variety of fields. So I thought it would be interesting to look at whether attitudes would actually change and to see through the frame of history and different crises whether Britain improves or worsens or stays the same in terms of its attitudes to immigrants after crises.
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, and so that's going to be my next question about how you decided to structure this article, because you, rather than just looking at Britain's current attitudes towards immigrants in response to this crisis, which seems to be fairly positive, you decided to take a much more historical look over quite a large period of time, seeing how um, different events have momentarily framed or reframed immigration attitudes within this country, and then how that sort of shifts back.
Yeah, I just thought it would be more comprehensive because a lot of the time we can get caught in what's in the present moment, and what is popular now and what is thought of now doesn't necessarily last in the long term. Like there's across a variety of movements, across a variety of ideas, the path of history isn't really a straight line. So it would be kind of easy to say, oh, things are kind of automatically getting better and they're just all going in one direction. But as you can see from a variety of things in the world, that isn't necessarily the case. So I thought it would be useful to look at various different examples, specifically within the British context, to kind of see exactly what might happen and to think about it. Because obviously we don't have like a crystal ball and can't predict, but history is useful in terms of getting some ideas of potentialities for the future.
And how did you find the process of doing that research? Like, was it quite an easy thing? Was there loads of information on it, or has the sort of role of immigration or immigrants sort of been buried a couple layers deep and you had to dig
It
for it?
kind of depends on which thing, but generally speaking, there isn't much. Like, for example, one of the things I looked at in the article was the 1918 riots, and there was very little information. Like, there was here and there, but there wasn't much in terms of deep information. So I had to collate a lot of different sources in terms of finding the information. And even aside from like the difficulty of researching, there's also the case of like a lot of the stuff I'm reading is not pleasant. So having to do that it was useful and necessary, but wasn't necessarily like joyful, happy reading, I guess.
I guess not. I suppose we should probably also say that as we're recording this, America is basically on fire with its own race
Yeah.
issues. Although that's nothing new, but yeah, the whole country seems to be ignited. So it's a very timely piece, quite pertinent, I think. So yeah, I suppose we should probably just wind back a little bit and talk about the article itself. So you looked at both world
Yeah.
wars in addition to COVID-19. So what did you find during those periods? What were the roles of immigrants and how did British people
I
respond?
mean, in the more holistic sense, both world wars were basically only able to be fought from most sides because of empires and because they could draw on this wealth and stuff from these different places. But in terms of the specific roles of immigrants, in the First World War, there were 140,000 Indians put on the Western Front by Britain, um, and they were actively on the front lines. And outside of the people who are actively on the front lines, a lot of the other work like shipbuilding and manufacturing of weapons, stuff like that, relied on labor from a lot of different immigrants from different places within the empire. So it was essentially immigrants, even in the First World War, were heavily important to the war effort. And then when you get to the Second World War, that is intensified. Even more troops from the colonies are essentially sent out to fight. 2 million Indian soldiers as opposed to just 140,000. And the reliance on manufacturing, military bases in North African nations is very high. And again, it's just a heightened version of that same thing of drawing on these nations. And I think part of the thing with the attitude change is it it was never really positive in the way that you could argue the attitudes with COVID-19 are, in that basically as soon as the war ended, a lot of people in politics, in general life, basically tried to get rid of immigrants across Europe and try to create propaganda about these things that these African soldiers had done to Western European women that were mostly false, if not entirely. But essentially, afterwards, the response was, "Okay, you've done what we want you to do. Get out now." That was the general thing for both those wars.
Yeah, and reading through your article again, it's shocking just how prevalent those opinions were. Like, it wasn't just on the fringes. So Winston Churchill was quite against immigrants. Theodore Roosevelt also voiced keen support about eugenics, and even on what I suppose is considered the left, it didn't, like with Clement Attlee, there didn't seem to be that sort of innate support for those who had sacrificed their lives for this country and for freedom.
Yeah, I think that's one of the key complications with specifically immigration in terms of the British context, is that neither side of politics or neither party ends up really looking good by the end at the end of it. Like Clement Attlee was actively writing letters to, or was trying to figure out ways that he could stop the HMS Windrush from leaving, and say, oh, maybe they could go stop in these different places along the way to essentially stop them from getting to Britain. So it's not a clean cut, oh, these were the people who supported immigration and these were the ones who didn't. It was very messy.
And then, of course, you couldn't talk about sort of British racism during that period of time without mentioning Enoch Powell. Sat on the fringes, but at the same time was given a platform.
Yeah, and I think part of the thing as well is, to remember with immigration things, that it's not like, I think a lot of the time immigration debates get framed in terms of, oh right, essentially the white working class want this, when in this period and through to today, the thing is that E.D. Morel, Enoch Powell, Winston Churchill, all these people are nowhere near the working class, and they are very much pushing this sort of policy and these ideas. And a lot of the time, they were pushing the ideas further than necessarily the public was even ready to go to. Like specifically with Winston Churchill in his second campaign, part of his thing was to try and make people even more against immigration than they actually were at the time. And that's why he had his proposed campaign slogan, "Keep England White." They end up not going with that because as much as people were very anti-immigration, they weren't quite Winston Churchill level anti-immigration. So it's very complicated in terms of the picture of who is and isn't actually in support of immigration throughout British history.
Yeah. So do you think, we will get on to COVID-19 and whether or not we think that Britain is ready to change, but looking back at history, do you think that the government response to immigration is different to the general public perception?
I think a lot of the time the government acts on what they think the people's reaction is, and a lot of the time that's filtered through their own prejudices and their own ideas, which means I think especially post World War II, but also kind of in World War One, they kind of feed off each other is the thing. It's hard to say the government started all the anti-immigration sentiment and then the people picked it up, or the people started all of it and then it went to the government. I think it's kind of symbiotic, but it's a lot of it's more on the government than a lot of the time they pretend it to be. Like, it's not just popular sentiment. A lot of the time, they're actively putting it on the agenda. Um, Again, specifically in the example of Winston Churchill post World War II, he and the rest of the cabinet were very hot on using that as part of their political platform.
Yeah. I mean, popular sentiment has to come from somewhere and it needs something to rally around. And very often it is those who are seeking to either get into
Yeah.
power or retain power. That hasn't changed throughout history at all. We still see that now. So I guess coming forward to today, what did you find in your article? I know that you spoke to a couple of experts about this, as well as like theorizing your own ideas based on what you're seeing in the news. So yeah, what's going on?
Yeah, I think the thing with today is that it seems as if there is definitely more rhetorical support of immigrants, like Boris Johnson deliberately thanking his nurses who were from, I think, New Zealand and Portugal. Um, and there is definitely more in terms of people making noise about how much they support immigrants, etc., etc. But part of the issue is it's hard to tell whether that verbal support will turn into action. Because, for example, the NHS surcharge on immigrants was removed for NHS workers, but for other key workers like cleaners or bus drivers or train drivers or whatever, they still have to pay that NHS surcharge. So if they, for example, got COVID-19 whilst being a key worker, they would still have to pay for the NHS that they're using, even though they're kind of keeping Britain running. And another thing is a lot of the Home Office policies that were there before COVID-19 are essentially still continuing. So there's the introduction of the bill to put in the points-based system, which is pretty restrictive and means that most key workers wouldn't have got into Britain based on this. And there's also the continuation of the no recourse to public funds, which basically means that there are, I think it's tens of thousands of immigrants who who are like legally in the country, but can't access the NHS or can't access essentially any public services. And that is still continuing to go on, despite the High Court ruling that it was unconstitutional according to human rights law. So it's complicated in terms of there is a lot of like vocalization of sentiment, but it's hard to see whether that's turning into real action. But at least that's on the like government side. Amongst society and general people, it's a bit more complicated.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I do wonder whether or not it is a government policy to just be callous towards immigrants, or whether or not there is just a degree of ignorance to it. Obviously, ignorance and Boris Johnson in the same sentence might not shock some people, but I read that he was actually shocked and baffled
Yeah,
by the fact that immigrants didn't have access to public funds,
yeah, I did
despite actually
read that.
voting
Yeah,
for it. Yeah. So there is possibility that he will review that. I don't think any noise has been made about that at the minute. I think the government's been somewhat tied up in, uh, you know, eye
everything.
tests and the like. Yeah, but there's a possibility that that will come about. But it certainly seems at the minute that what they are saying and then what they are doing doesn't correlate.
Yeah.
Specifically, of course, over Windrush and that continued drama. Yeah, that's quite shocking. Yeah, so while the government may not be acting particularly holistically or fairly to immigrants, what do you think about society? Because previously you mentioned that what the government's doing and what society's doing is slightly out of step. Do you reckon that's the same here?
Yeah, because when I interviewed Patrick English for the article, he talked about how over time, even though there have been like variations, broadly speaking, anti-immigrant sentiment has decreased across time and is continuing to decrease. So that's what I mean by it's complicated because in terms of society as a whole, it seems as if things could be going in a good direction. But the problem is like there's a difference between I don't hate immigrants and I'm going to actually support parties who like support immigrants, or I'm going to like petition my MP or whoever party that may be to support immigrants. I think that's maybe the issue in terms of society, where as much as people don't maybe hate immigrants as much as they used to, it doesn't necessarily mean they're taking the action and taking the steps to make sure people are treated better by government or society as a whole.
Sure, it's more like we're going to tolerate you rather than we're going to advocate for you.
Yeah, and I think definitely part of that at least that I felt in terms of the response to COVID-19 is the that a lot of it is predicated on like good immigrant ideas. So the idea of the good immigrant is the idea that there is this model version of an immigrant that they come into the country, they assimilate into the culture, they don't complain when they experience racism or xenophobia or whatever, and they do the jobs that need to be done without complaining and without like ruffling any feathers. And I feel like a lot of the time support of immigrants is kind of predicated on that. So it's like, oh yeah, we'll support these immigrants who are doctors because hey, they're part of our NHS that's keeping us alive. But that doesn't necessarily extend to, for example, a lot of the time the sentiment doesn't extend to refugees because the idea is, oh, they're not economically or socially quote unquote useful. All that doesn't necessarily extend to other people who do still do important things like cleaners because people don't see them in that esteemed kind of, oh, they're essential kind of vibe. So it's very complicated in terms of um, society and its view of immigrants because conditional acceptance is unreliable at best and often just means that we get slightly nicer versions of policies which are still kind of callous.
So it's sort of more like seen and not heard
Mm-hmm.
is kind of the attitude they take. But do you think that we're very optimistic thinking here? Do you think that the concept of what is an essential or a key worker is going to change once COVID-19 is all finished and dealt with? Because now we sort of have like a wider appreciation of those who stack the shelves or do the cleaning or keep that public transport running. Are we going to see that shift in what a key worker is? And do you think, by extension of that, we will start to have more of an appreciation of the people who do it?
I mean, I really hope we do. Like, I really hope that we start to appreciate the people who don't have jobs that read as like flashy or intelligent or whatever to people. Like, I really hope we appreciate them, but it's hard to tell. Like, it's just really hard to tell, at least in the short term, what that actually means in terms of longer term change. Because a lot of the time when we talk about key workers, people often, and I specifically have fallen into this as well, and people have caught me up on it. When I say key worker, and then actually just mean like doctors and nurses, as opposed to meaning everyone who is a key worker. And I think I really hope that we as a society look and see, oh, these people are doing work that's really important and that's really essential, and that like we would not be able to operate without these people doing the things that they do. And I hope it changes. I honestly I feel like it's a flip of the coin.
Yeah.
Things that determine change in Britain are really hard to tell, and Britain likes to kind of not change and just stick with its previous ideas. But we will see, I guess.
We will see. I'm also going to throw a spanner in the works here. Do you think that Brexit, remember that, do you think Brexit is going to have an impact on this? Because obviously we used to get like a lot of seasonal migration, and now that is likely to come to a stop. Do you think that would help increase or decrease our appreciation of immigrants, especially considering that immigration was like the driving factor that delivered Brexit in the first place?
I mean, I don't know. I feel like it depends on what it gets blamed on in terms of like immigration was often kind of the scapegoat for a lot of issues. So a lot of issues people had with society, they kind of channeled it into immigration and immigrants. So it basically depends as to whether immigrants become the next scapegoat or whether something else does. Because I I think Brexit, like the results of Brexit, could be in so many different directions, and especially it's complicated by COVID-19. So essentially, It means that it could go in any direction in terms of what people blame for the issues, because on the net, in terms of economically at least, immigrants are net economic benefit. They're pretty much net social benefit if we want to talk in those terms. So I think it's ultimately a case of perceptions rather than the reality of whether there are more or less immigrants. So I think it really does just depend on what do the politicians of the next 5 years decide is the issue in this country, and what do the media in the next 5 to 10 years decide what is the issue in this country, as opposed to necessarily being a thing of, oh, people automatically appreciate immigrants more now that there's less of them around or whatever.
So if I tried to push you off of the fence and make you make a decision as to whether or not you think this country is going to fall on the side of supporting immigration or rejecting it based on COVID-19, based on all of the historical evidence that you've got, where do you think the dice will fall?
Oof. I think I'm going to go with the pessimist in me and say rejecting it. Because if you see with the patterns to do with post the Great War and post World War II, when there were spikes in unemployment like there is now, and Patrick English was talking about how after financial crises, after the early 1990s and 2007-8, there was an increase in hostility towards immigration. And we are like on course for a massive financial crisis, and we are on course for massive unemployment. So it would be very easy for particularly politicians, but also people, to blame that on immigrants. So I feel like it could very much get worse because immigrants are kind of an easy target in this country and more broadly in the world.
Well, I hope you're wrong. I feel like there should be a significant difference between blaming immigrants and blaming a virus that was like a global pandemic, but we will see.
Yeah. Hopefully it gets better.
Hopefully, fingers crossed. So if you are interested in reading the whole article that Teo has written, it's called Will COVID-19 Affect Attitudes to Immigration? And it can be found on voicemag.uk. And if you want to see more of the stuff that Teo's writing, Teo, where can they find you?
You can find me at Teo Writes on Instagram, at NigerPrince21 on Twitter. If you can't spell that, it will be in the show notes. And of course, you can find me on Voice if you search voicemag.uk/Teo. I think that's how it works.
I think it's /user/Teo.
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah. Or you can just search Teo and he will appear. He also actually is the regular host of Voice Extra podcast. I'm just standing in because it'd be really weird if he was talking to himself for 30 minutes. I'm sure he would, but we'd give him someone to bounce off of. I've been Tom Innes. Thank you so much for listening. I am in charge of another podcast, which is the Voice Magazine podcast, and you can find that by just searching for it. Until next time, thank you so much for listening. Please go like and subscribe, all of our social media and podcasty stuff. And I hope you have a pleasant day. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thanks to Kevin MacLeod for letting us use Shaving Mirror. You can find his stuff on incompetech.com.